Good afternoon. Thank you all for being with us. I'm really excited to get to have a conversation today with two people I admire greatly. I'm going to introduce real quick ARNE Duncan, who was Secretary of Education under President Barack Obama and is now managing partner at Emerson Collective, and Margaret Spellings, who served as Secretary of Education under George W. Bush and is Executive Director of Texas 2036. I just wanted to start by thanking both of you for taking the time to be here with us this afternoon and for really everything that you're doing right now to provide leadership around supporting students and schools and leaders and teachers. You know, how many times a day do we say we're in unprecedented times? You both were leaders, though, during crises in our country. Margaret in the aftermath of 9/11 and ARNE during and coming out of the Great Recession, but we really never have had massive school closures and disruption to learning in the ways that we have seen this year. And so I wanted to start with just a question for both of you about what have you seen as the biggest impacts, you know, that COVID-19 has had on K through 12 education? Are we learning anything through this, and what have we lost? Margaret, you want to start with you?
Well, we're learning a lot, and we've adapted quickly. I've heard someone say the other day that we made more progress in online learning in the last 6 months than we made in the last, 2 decades. And so I think it's showing the adaptability of our educators around safety, around technology, around supports for families, and the like. Parents are learning a lot about their own students and their progress. And I think the engagement between our educators and our parents, particularly advantaged parents, are strong. To the downside, and it's a big downside, the learning loss that is being experienced, the students who are just lost to the system. In Texas, we just released some information. We're down about 250,000 students in Texas, a 6% drop in enrollment when normally we're growing at about 2%. So obviously kids aren't learning if they're not in school. And so there are just serious issues around learning loss, and just that we need to pull up and address immediately. But sure, we're learning a lot about adaptation, about technology, about the relationship with families, about the strength of our educators, about the importance of our schools, and about the problems and the systemic equities that have plagued us for years.
ARNE, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just on the downside, as Margaret talked about, there's potentially a couple million kids that have not basically been to school or had an educational experience since March. And this combination of, the high-tech stuff is great, the technology is great, but sort of low-tech, high-touch, going out to visit homes, finding those kids, bringing them back in. I can't overstate how important that is. We cannot lose a generation of kids who are already, by definition, marginalized, disenfranchised, are most vulnerable. In a really dark time, what can kids gain? What can kids learn? I actually think it's pretty interesting. I think we are learning some really important lessons around empathy, about how interconnected we all are. If my kids are okay, but the family on our block or in the neighborhood isn't okay, isn't safe, then none of us are safe. I think we're learning the importance of science. I think we're learning the importance of participating in democracy. And our kids are living these really tough but really important lessons, I think, in a profound way. And if they can stay engaged for the next 30, 40 years, 50 years, for me, it makes me think it's a chance the future of our country could be very bright, not just despite of, but maybe because of this really dark time.
Mm-hmm. You both touched on this issue of learning loss and obviously the loss of potentially millions of kids, hundreds of thousands in Texas. You mentioned Margaret. And I wanted to ask you, and hope you don't mind, if maybe you sort of take us a little bit down memory lane and a little bit of history. I think for folks who are listening and tuning in and don't, we talk about measuring and annual assessments, and it can be maybe a little obscure to the layperson. It feels like in this time where we lost, maybe 3 months at the end of last school year, we're now into full virtual learning. And I think it's probably generous to say it's a mixed bag of the experiences that students are having. Can you talk about, it just seems like measuring now more important than ever. Can you talk a little bit about sort of where we were, say sort of pre-2000? Why is measuring so important in this issue of annual assessments, and sort of where did we come from, and why is it important now?
One of the most important reforms of No Child Left Behind was to require annual assessment in reading and math one time a year in every grade from 3 through 8, and one time in high school. I think people often overstate what the federal requirement, the federal mandate was on assessment. Now, certainly states and localities added a lot of assessments to that, maybe got a little bit out of hand. But the truth was we didn't have that kind of annual measurement. We didn't have it in disaggregated ways. In other words, for educators and policymakers so that they could understand how every child was doing. And further, and importantly, we didn't have every state participating in the NAEP, our National Education Report Card. About 30 states participated every year. It wasn't the same 30. And so No Child Left Behind, and frankly, this reform lives to this day, was embraced as part of ESSA with the strong support of President Obama and Secretary Duncan and a bipartisan coalition. This annual measurement is critical. I like to say we have to care enough to find out how students are doing, and that's in the assessment realm. And so that's what's critical now. Will obviously poses some issues around accountability. We need to separate those two discussions, but assessment is vital, and more so today than ever.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And anytime you go to the doctor asks how you're doing, what's going on and how are you feeling. The doctor is evaluating you, is assessing you, trying to figure out what's going on. I don't know how we help kids catch up. I don't know how we help them move forward if we don't know where they are. So I think if schools have not done it yet this fall, I think it's vitally important, critically important to assess now, to figure out where kids are. There'll be a small percent of kids that have actually accelerated during this time, whereas online learning is great for them. There'll be a lot of kids that are sort of doing okay, and there'll be a significant minority of kids who have fallen, unfortunately, very far behind. But again, we have to know where they are to help them catch up. So to assess now, to assess at the end of the year, as Margaret said, talking about assessments and accountability, those are two different things. They're related, but we need to separate them out. And I would argue that an annual assessment, it was fantastic to get in the game, but we should be thinking about ongoing assessments. Again, low stakes, no stakes, but every month, every week, just figuring out not what are we teaching, but what are kids learning. Again, as Margaret said, if we care about them, we have to know. We have to know.
And you know what? The other thing, Cheryl, I would say is if we don't know, it'll be an excuse for policymakers to underinvest and not provide the resources that we absolutely need to help these kids get caught up. So I don't want the ostrich approach to be an excuse for not resourcing these critical issues.
It's not a non-controversial thing though, right? It feels like we've been there's been a little bit of it wasn't the easiest thing to sort of get, included in sort of reauthorization of ESSA. There's certainly a contingent of folks that don't appreciate assessing and annual assessments. And it feels now, certainly it made a lot of sense at the end of the last school year to pause assessments given the shutdown of schools. But it feels like this is an issue now, and there's going to be some effort to to halt assessments this year for a variety of reasons, excuses maybe. Do you see that happening, and what can we do?
Well, I'm pleased that Secretary DeVos has said that we will give spring assessments, and I hope that will be true if we have an Obama administration, if we have a Biden administration. And I think commissioners around the country are taking that lead. It's incumbent upon us as leaders, though, that we help our educators figure out, how is this going to work? Are we going to have testing centers? Are they going to be proctored? Are we going to delay assessment into the summer as opposed to the mid-spring in places like Texas, so that states will have more time? We might have more penetration of the vaccine. I mean, we need to solve some of these practical problems that our educators and the naysayers rightly observe. And so I hope we will do that together. You know, this is the Pro Accountability Coalition is the civil rights community and the business community. And we need to re-engage both of those folks, groups of folks, so that we can make progress on these issues.
Just to quickly add, I think when we talk about assessment, we often talk about reading and math, and that's important. I just think we need to be thinking much more broadly than that. We need to be assessing kids now based upon their hunger, food insecurity. And we've done a weekly call since March with school districts around the country who, even as school buildings shut down, continue to feed the community. But there are record numbers of families whose lives have been just upended, and we need to make sure we're taking care of those kids. We need to be assessing their social and emotional health. We have lots of kids that are dealing with lots of trauma, you know, prior to the pandemic, prior to George Floyd's murder. But now we have many, many more, hundreds of thousands of kids dealing with just upheaval at home, upheaval in their community. And so I want to be assessing all of those things. Yes, reading and math, but that's the starting point. That's not where we need to end.
I completely agree, and I wonder if that obviously sort of feeds into a, you know, maybe a broader, more sort of futuristic conversation about assessments and where do we go from here. Maybe this is a time, this crisis is providing us a time to really pause and think about what good assessments need to look like and the types of things that we need to be assessing. You know, you often hear this word high stakes associated with tests. I'd love your sort of take on that, you know, stakes and for whom, sort of in a typical year and then sort of in this uncertain time. You've talked a little bit, I think, Margaret, you talked about decoupling from accountability, maybe in this year. Just your thoughts on the sort of stakes piece of it.
I'm going to quote you back to yourself, Cheryl, because I know you talk about, you know, high stakes for whom? It's high stakes for students, not to have their progress monitored and not to get help if they've fallen behind. We often think of high stakes in terms of educators or other adults, but the highest stakes of all, of course, are for our students. And I do agree with you that this might be a time for us to reinvent assessment. You know, maybe in terms of accountability, just attendance and figuring out who got there and how many hours or minutes did they learn each day. I mean, there are going to be some things. Look, we taxpayers are still paying a full load for the education of our students. And yes, it's hard, but we do need to get a little something for our money, namely, you know, productive learning for our students. So how we think about accountability this year in the absence of more fulsome assessment is certainly before us. And things like attendance, teacher attendance, student attendance, how much learning is going on, the supports that Arne talked about, food and mental health supports and the like.
I would love to, you know, we talked about this disruptions this spring and, you know, costing students time and stalling their progress. Arne, I heard you talk in another interview just about, you know, low-income families and really are those that are sort of disproportionately feel the impact anytime we have an economic crisis or really any sort of crisis in this country. The poorest children are often the furthest behind in any normal circumstance. And then we're in this situation where, maybe broadband, they're not able to access. What are you seeing today with regard to kind of our lowest income, lowest income students, our most vulnerable students right now?
Well, I think you're seeing a wide spectrum of things. I'll start with what's amazing. I've seen, Chicago giving out 100,000 districts, Chicago giving out 100,000 devices, Boston 30,000, South Bend, Indiana, using school buses to be Wi-Fi hotspots in their poor communities. San Antonio, a very poor district, or one of my good friends is a superintendent, 49,000 kids have given out 47,000 devices. So you're seeing people moved with unbelievable speed and urgency to try and close that digital divide and give kids a chance to learn. Again, we talked about the food and what folks have done across the country to feed children, to feed their families, and to feed the broader community. Schools as food distribution centers. So that's been remarkable. You're seeing now some districts starting to send teachers and social workers to the homes of kids who haven't shown up and trying to bring them back in. So I love that urgency. I love that commitment. I love how hard folks are working. But at the end of the day, I've seen reports that between 2 and 3 million children across America have not been back to school. That's a devastating, if that's even close to being true, I assume it is, that's a devastating reality. And so whatever we are doing is not enough. And we have to just get out there on the blocks, in the streets, on people's homes, in people's homes, sit on their porches, find out what's going on, and find out how we bring those kids back to school. If they fall a year and a half behind, they may never catch up. And there's a hard thing to say, some may never return to school. We cannot just sit back and allow that to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about, the potential for a generation of sort of a lost generation if we really don't, like you said, if they don't ever come back. And then it sort of brings me full circle back around to this issue of assessment. Like if we're not measuring, if we lose this piece this year and we don't know where all those kids are, the 2 million that maybe aren't logging in, how do we get them the supports? Sort of who loses most if we don't measure and we don't really understand where everybody is academically?
And Cheryl, it can only be, the table setter for the intervention. I mean, we have to find out where our students are, if they're there, so that we can find them, we can resource their remediation or their path to catching up, that we can engage the families, et cetera. And so, I'm pretty confident if this data from Texas, which we're highly confident in, of 250,000 students, we have about 10% of the kids in our country. And so, yeah, I think it is about 2.5 million children. I mean, we are rightly concerned about the couple 100,000 deaths from COVID, but think about 2 to 3 million people who are suffering from the lack of ability to have a bright economic future or create a happy family life or contribute to a community. I mean, it's a horrifying prospect, and we can't let it stand.
Yeah. Great. The two of you wrote a piece pre-COVID. I had so much fun going back and reading all of your, all the things that you two have done together. It's a great lesson in sort of nonpartisanship, bipartisanship. You co-wrote a piece and you talked about sort of the lack of a broad coalition that we used to enjoy on all of these issues, and that we sort of all know what to do, but we were cursed with complacency on taking action. And I'm wondering, in thinking back on those things, it was sort of, we know what to do, high standards, accountability with local innovation, encouraging choice and diversity. Do those things still hold for you now? Or would you change it? Would you add to that list? And then I want to get to the question about that coalition, and particularly the Civil Rights and Business Coalition, and how do we build that? But first, does that still hold true for you, that list?
ARNE?
I don't remember that exact list, but the things you just listed, they absolutely hold true. I think what's often or always been true in education is that it's not so much putting a man on Mars or finding a cure to cancer. We actually really know what works for kids. Great teachers work for kids. Great principals work for kids. Great technology works for kids. Meeting them where they are works for kids. Figuring out who needs more help works for kids. Figuring out who needs acceleration, that works for kids. Understanding where we are, having transparency, not being opaque, works for kids. What we've lacked is courage, is political courage and the will to do those things. So the question, whether it's 5 years ago or 10 years ago or today or 5 years from now, is do we have the courage to do what we know works best, to give kids not just a chance to get a great education, which is obviously critically important, but to break cycles of poverty, to become productive citizens, to have a pathway to the middle class, to build a stronger communities and stronger country. That's what this work is about. This is nation building work.
Yeah.
And it's about leadership. I mean, ARNE and I were both privileged to work for presidents who believed in the power of education and believed in the importance of federal leadership, both in terms of a moral imperative, but also with respect to investing in practices that work, that many of enumerated by ARNE. And so we really need that clarion call, that coming together with a top-down plus bottom-up approach.
Well, I'd love your thoughts and maybe in sort of, as a wrap-up quick conversation. You have an audience that is made up of a lot of state and local chambers, the business community. We've always sort of played a really important role, I think, together with the civil rights community. But, what do we need to be doing? Like, what advice would you give to those folks listening? Advice to the U.S. Chamber. We are committed to these issues, and we want to sort of get back to that really robust partnership and leadership within the business community. But I think we've got some work to do. So I would love advice from the two of you.
ARNE, you go first. Okay, I'll run up. I think we need to get real and help our universities. We need to collect what data we have. I'm encouraged about ARNE's calls with urban superintendents. I mean, we need to learn what's going on out there and help them address these challenges so that we can be not just table pounders about what we expect and what we want. We should do that, but we also need to be in solution mode through these challenging days.
There's two quick things just to challenge the business community, whether it's in Texas or across the country, U.S. Chamber. One is we need your partnership, and K-12 and higher ed are not the easiest systems to work with, and I get the frustration sometimes with bureaucracy. But internships, mentorships, career days, chances for young people to be exposed to your places of work. I can't overstate how important that is. But the second thing we need the business community to do is challenge us as educators. And I think in far too many communities and far too many states, the business community is frankly passive, too quiet, too accepting when things aren't going well, when there aren't high standards, when we aren't serious about assessment. And we want the business community to be a partner, but also to be a critical friend and challenge us. And if their voices were a little louder, if they were a little clearer about what they were looking for, I think I wouldn't even call it pressure. That encouragement, that clarity, I think is desperately needed, both on K-12 education and higher ed, community colleges across the country. We need businesses to step into this space, as frustrating, as difficult as it might sometimes be. We can't get where we need to go for kids or for the country without your leadership and without you challenging us.
Well, I think that's a great way to end, and I thank you both for that charge. And I would just say to both of you that you can rely on us to be that partner, and we will continue to do what we can to sort of mobilize both our members, but also our partners in state and local chambers. And I would say to those that are listening, please be in touch and join us in this. We are, as I said, committed to these issues going forward, and whatever we can do, please both of you consider us a partner in that. So thank you both so much.
Cheryl, appreciate it.